Hey, we're back in the rock, paper, scissors game, and we're going to determine a winner in this video. So right now we've got the players have chosen rock, paper, and scissors, and they're showing them to the player playing um, the game. What we're going to do is to determine the winner, we're going to first check and see if there's a tie, because that'll take care of 3 out of the 9 combinations that are possible. Then we'll check if the player has rock, because if the player has rock, there's only 2 possibilities left, that the computer has paper or scissors. And we can use an if then else because that accounts for 2 possibilities. Then we're going to check if the player has paper, because if the player has paper, there's only 2 possibilities left for the computer, rock or scissors. And then if the player has scissors is the last thing to check, then the computer either has rock or it has paper. So then we're also going to make sure that the winner says I win, or if there's a tie, both of them will say it's a tie. We'll also keep track of wins for both the player and the computer and ties, so that later on we can show those to the player as statistics. So we're going to start by making those variables right now. Adding a player wins variable, a computer wins variable, and a ties variable. And this will store the number of computer wins, player wins, and ties once we get the game really rolling. In the stage is where we'll do all of this work. So when the green flag is clicked, we're actually just going to go ahead and set those variables to 0 so that we start off the game with a brand new set of variables. Then we need to determine the winner the way we said we're going to. But also we need to be told it's time to determine the winner, and that's in the computer, because the computer shows after the player does. So they're the last one to act, so we're actually going to add a broadcast here and a new message called determine winner, so we can tell the stage it's time to actually determine the winner. In the stage, then we can use the when I receive determine winner to start, and then we can start checking conditions. So first thing we're going to do is check if there's a tie. To do that, we just need to check if the computer and player have the same thing using a simple equals. If they're not, then we'll go on to if the player is rock and so on. So if there is a tie, then we want to make sure that both players know there's a tie, and we're going to add 1 to the tie. So we'll change ties by 1, and then we'll also broadcast with a new message called tie. And that way the players know it's a tie, and we can react in those sprites with saying it's a tie. Then back to the stage, because if it's not a tie, then we're going to check and see if the player has rock. So that way we can use an if then else statement inside of that if the player does have rock, and just check if the player has, or if the computer has paper or scissors. So if the player has rock, then the only 2 possibilities are that the computer has paper or the computer has scissors. So again, an if then else in there as well. So either the player or the computer has paper, and if it doesn't have paper, then it must have scissors. If the computer has paper, then the computer wins, because paper covers rock. So we're going to add another broadcast for the computer winning, and that way the computer can use that to react by saying I win. Also, we're going to make sure we add 1 to the computer wins. However, if the computer doesn't have paper and we know that the player has rock, and we know that the computer can't have rock or paper, then the only thing left is that the computer must have scissors. Therefore, the player won. So we're going to change the player wins by 1, and we're going to add a new broadcast event called player win. And there's a lot of this stuff we're doing ahead of time that will then become easier because we don't have to do any more of it later. Because once we set in motion things like the player win and the computer win and the tie, when we get to the next instance of the computer or player winning, then we don't have to add any more code. We just have to add the code here in the stage. So now if the player doesn't have rock, then it could still have paper. So we're going to add another if then else inside of the else and check when the player has paper. And if the player has paper, then the computer can only have one of two things. Either the computer has rock or it has scissors. And again, because we've checked ties already, we don't have to worry about the instance where computer has paper. So if the computer has rock and the player has paper, then the player wins. So we just have to add all the code for the player winning, changing player wins by 1 and then adding our broadcast. And since we've already reacted in the player sprite, we don't need to do anything else. Now if the computer doesn't have rock, the only thing left, because we've already accounted for paper up here in the ties, is that the computer has scissors, which means the computer wins. So we'll add all the computer win code to that. So now we've checked ties. If it's a tie, we change the ties, we broadcast a tie. If it's not a tie, then we're checking if the player has rock. And if the player has rock, then the computer can only have paper or scissors. If the computer has paper, they win. If they have scissors, then the player wins. If the player doesn't have rock, then the player could have paper. If the player has paper, then the computer could have rock or it could have scissors. If it has rock, it wins. If it has scissors, if it has rock, the player wins. If it has scissors, it wins. So finally, down here, we don't need to check if the player has scissors because we already know that it doesn't have paper and it doesn't have rock and it's not a tie. So therefore, the only thing left is that it has scissors, and the only two choices left for the computer are, does it have rock or paper? So we're just going to check, does the computer have paper? Because if the computer has paper and the player has scissors, then the player wins. So we change player wins by 1, and we broadcast a player wins. Otherwise, the only thing left, the only combination left is that the player has scissors and the computer has rock. Therefore, the computer wins. We broadcast a computer win. And now we're all set. Now we can check. We know that these work, so I'm going to turn those off so I don't see them. And I'm only going to be concerned with the player wins, computer wins, and ties for now. So now when I press a key, right, rock beats scissors, so that works. So I restart to make sure that the game is working properly. All right, it's a tie. And if I do this several times, scissors cuts paper, paper covers rock. I don't need to get all the combinations. I just need to know that it's consistently doing it. And I know that it's ready for the final bit, which is going to be to add the title screen, instruction screen, stat screen, and maybe a nice background for this game screen. And then go through all that code to figure out how we make that happen.